Hello,
Hi.
my name is Rodney Walker. As you know, I'm a student at Regent University in the PhD in Counseling and Psychological Studies. I am here to do a short interview with you two on leadership and Christian counseling and everything that entails with your job description. I aspire to do these things as well. So I have Betty Joanne Scott and Arthur Scott here. And I'm going to ask you both a decent amount of questions just to get a feel on all of the things that you guys do. And I'm not going to get into clients and
No.
confidentiality and everything like that. So the first question is can you give me a sketch or a short overview of your biography or your career paths that led up to this point in your professional development?
Brother, you can start. A before B.
Well, I started out going into, when I went to college and seminary, went into pastoral ministry, and after several years of that, was becoming aware of how much emphasis I put on counseling, and so I chose to move in the direction of counseling, and by one means or another, we ended up here at the center, and where we're at. That's sort of the thumbnail of it.
My thumbnail's a little bigger. I was born and raised a preacher's kid, and I tell people that I became aware of my calling to pastoral counseling as probably a 5-year-old.
Wow.
At least I preached the word about what you had to do to be a good married couple and have a good marriage to my babysitter and her husband. Throughout my years as a preacher's kid, college student, and later preacher's wife, I found people coming to me with issues that I wasn't prepared to deal with. I understood, I cared, but I didn't know what to do to help. And several times we would refer some of these people to Christian counselors in our area, and a couple of them, because they were victims of domestic violence, I took them to their sessions and at their request sat in on sessions, and I thought, oh, Lord, I'm doing a better job than this without any training. I think we need to get some training because I'm feeling over my head. And that sort of became my path in looking at training as a therapist. I was doing it and I felt like I was afraid I could do harm rather than help. So I wanted some skills. So I went and got 2 master's degrees in counseling.
That's awesome to hear that the story, the way you put it. I know a lot of people, a lot of churches and everything, some of them don't get the extra skills that you said, like the master's degrees and get the clinical training and stuff, because they think that they can just do it and lean on God for guidance and stuff without realizing that God has given guidance through education as well, not just through, what they feel and stuff like that. So I think that is great. So can you tell me a little bit about your actual degrees that you attained and where you obtained them from, and I guess the year you got them?
Arthur, start with you again.
Oh. Well, my bachelor's degree was from Roberts Weston College in Rochester, New York. It's affiliated with our faith tradition. Got a degree, had a double major, English and religion philosophy. Then I went on to Asbury Seminary and graduated from there with a master's in divinity.
Your graduation was 76.
76. And then later, when I took my program, I graduated from the University of Wilfrid Laurier in
for.
So those would be my specific degrees along the way.
And did you get like any? How was the clinical process for you?
I was part of
Co-MFT.
where we did our clinical work alongside us, so it was a 2-year program. So we did classwork and it's all of our clients all in the same counseling agency. And so there were over 20 of us in the internship, and we had several different supervisors. So, but it was a 2-year program, so we got to come out of there at least with several hundred hours of actual face-to-face work with clients, plus a couple hundred hours of supervision. So it was a great program.
Seems intimidating, but
It was intimidating, and I did my degrees at the same place, Wilfrid Laurier University. I did a Master's of Theological Studies, graduated from that in 92? What? And then got a Master's of Theology in Pastoral Counseling and graduated from that in 96. Part of that process, I'm competitive. I was reading for him and doing some of the same classes he was doing. He was getting a Master's of Theology, I was getting an MTS. I wanted the same letters. It also, that whole piece of wanting to feel like I knew and could cope was a big incentive to going on for the MTH. I did not get into the co-AMFT program that he was in, so I did my coursework and did my clinicals. I did practicum during my coursework, but did my clinicals while I was writing my thesis, and after I completed my thesis. So that when I completed my clinicals, I completed the AMFT requirements of, I guess I had to do 2,500 hours of face-to-face with, 300? No, 250. 250 hours of direct supervision. I think that's imperative.
Mm-hmm.
I get scared when I see people working with clients with much more limited experience and not being required supervision. Just my sidebar there. But, so both of us wrote theses. That was a lot of work.
Yes, I bet. I'm definitely not looking forward to my dissertation or anything, but I know it's coming. Okay, so another question I have is, what ways do you integrate faith and theology in your professional work, if you do it at all?
Well, I believe I do, but as far as directly in the session, if a client wants faith and spiritual things integrated into it, then it's much more sort of upfront and interactive around faith and biblical things. But I think I do it in essentially with all my sessions because of my faith background, I'm perceiving and understanding clients from that context. I don't necessarily say that, but it helps me in giving me an assessment of where I think they are, but being able to work with them with the concerns and issues that they bring, so that I believe my faith informs me of understanding more of who they are and what some of their issues and some of their concerns are, so that I had a supervisor who strongly believed in we all have our God talk, or we all have our belief or faith system. So even if somebody walks in the room and said, I'm an agnostic, they still have a belief system. And so that I don't necessarily try and convince them of my belief. However, it becomes very important in helping me understand who this person is, and it helps me from the standpoint of informing me to interact with them in a caring and compassionate way, so that they're feeling cared for out of the perspective of the loving Christian faith. So I think in that sense it's not always out front and center, but it's very much there, a part of who I am, a part of every session.
Start with a quick story about the very first client at this center, who was not ours. But I've heard the founding director tell this story. His first client at the center, when she called in, reiterated countless times during the initial phone call, I'm an atheist, but I want to come to your center. And he said throughout the initial session, she kept, I'm an atheist. And at the end of the session, he said, I asked her if I could ask her one more question. And my question to her was, as an atheist, why did you choose pastoral counseling? Oh, that's easy, she replied. Other people are in it, and it's a job. I knew you'd care. Because we trained in Ontario, the name for the pastoral counseling group was Pastoral Care and Counseling. And I like that. That's just my sidebar. How do I do it? I'm probably a lot more overt than some, but very respectful of those clients who don't want to go there. I just let them know. I've read a bunch of wisdom literature. I'm pretty consistent in much of the wisdom literature. Is this idea, how does that fit for you? How does that work for you? And I'm not here to evangelize. From a wee child, I heard repeatedly, you can't argue them into the kingdom. I like to argue and debate. You can't drag them into the kingdom. You can't convince them into the kingdom. All you can do is love them. And I think that frames how I work as a pastoral counselor. And it's how I've worked in secular organizations as well. Scripture says, I'll know you're Christians by your love. I don't have to say anything or do anything, except make sure that what I say, what I do, is consistent with my understanding of what Scripture has taught me and what I have learned in my faith journey. And I kind of leave it there. So I'm not here preaching at them. I'm not here trying to convince them to move from their brand of faith to another brand of faith. Just meet them where they are and be informed by their faith.
Wow, that's really good. I think sometimes as Christians, some of us forget the love part before we try to get them converted over, because it's like, you're going to go to hell if you don't save your soul. And when you say that to somebody, they hear hell, 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 and then it's like associated with torment and all this bad
Yeah, you can't
stuff.
scare them in.
Exactly. And if you do scare someone in, then that wouldn't really be a solid foundation with them in Christ if they're only doing this because of being afraid of going to hell. I mean, that's kind of how I look at someone saying that to me.
What is it? Fisher? World Development? Identifies that as the elementary stage.
Yeah, they definitely the elementary stage. Trying to scare people into it.
Yeah. Oh.
Fowler, that's right. It was an F word.
So my next question, you guys kind of already expressed it to me before we started, but I'm gonna ask it again because maybe it changed since since I asked. Looking forward, how do you see your profession changing in the future? And I was referring to you guys saying being
Right.
retired, but
I don't. Some levels it'll, if we were to continue on, it would change at some levels, but so much of our world is going to the evidence-based, moving into the cognitive behavioral and all of that, and typically I'm more focused on, and I agree with, I think it was Ian Percy in his book who said our two most profound ways of learning are emotional and spiritual, so that I don't know that we really effectively address the emotional and spiritual solely through cognitive behavioral. It has its impact, so that, if I were carrying on for another
20 years?
20 or so years, I would still very much stick to the psychodynamic, the internal, the
Internal family systems.
spiritual aspects of it, but I'm still open to and allowing, because even in today's world, a lot of talk is used about mindfulness. Great strategy, great way to help ourselves through things. So if somebody wants to talk in terms of mindfulness, fine. I might be more likely to refer to it as a meditation, or what I grew up with is sort of a devotional aspect. But if somebody wants to reflect on that and think of it as mindfulness, that's fine. I'll work with that. So that in that sense, I think we can very much use today's research, whether it be through emotional intelligence or whether it be through
It's like it's the neurological stuff that they're doing now.
the neurolinguistics and all of that. So I don't know in actual practice that it would change. There would be a lot of things along the way that would inform me to interact a little, maybe approach some things slightly differently. But I believe with Solomon, there's nothing new under the sun. So all of these new things they come up with, they've already been done before. They just might attach a new name to it.
Mm-hmm.
For example, DBT. We had interns here in 2010, 11, somewhere in there. And they says, where did you learn to do DBT like you do it? And I said, huh? DBT, you guys are so good at it. That was the clinical interview process we were taught.
So I think being informed of what's the research and all that's being done is great, and that would impact. But as far as sort of the basic approach, I don't think I'd really shift a whole lot. I would There's always new things to learn about.
Mm.
I'm excited by learning about how the brain works and how that impacts. But I keep coming back to the, like Arthur says, there's not a whole lot new. Different tweaks of understanding, perhaps, but not a whole lot new. One of my problems was the quote evidence based theories is that they're tools. We use them, but we use them as tools. We don't use them as, okay, you do these 6 mindfulness or these 6 CBT worksheets and that will solve your problem with anxiety or whatever. I remember when brief solution focused therapy was coming on the horizon. I was working on my comprehensive paper, I think it was. Yeah, I was, because it was the paper on Jeremiah. And a passage that was near the passage I was working with in my comprehensive paper said in the prophet speaking to the leaders of Israel, "You have healed the wounds of my people lightly." I came across that phrase in my research and study right before we did a 4-hour workshop on brief solution focused therapy. And our lead trainer supervisor walked out of the room right behind me and he says, "What'd you think of that?" He was my comprehensive paper advisor. I said, "Peter, I just read this statement. You have healed the wounds of my people lightly." Scares the wits out of me. Over the years, I've had enough clients who've done brief therapy, and then they've called in again in desperation. They've avoided coming back to therapy for years. They call in desperation. I'll give it one last try, but I'm a failure at therapy too. I went to counseling once before and it didn't work. Do I want to know what the evidence-based quote-unquote therapies are? Yeah. Do I want to use some of their strategies? Yeah. But over and over and over, when Arthur was working on his thesis, which should have been a dissertation, he kept coming out with the healing is in the relationship. Comes out of object relationship. And the healing is in the relationship. It isn't in the tools we use. And please, cite him, not me.
So I got a question too. So on the healing is in a relationship, and then the different, things that you guys said so far, I have a question. It's not written down, but it's something that
Ask it.
we had it in my previous class. So it's concerning artificial intelligence. So how do you feel about artificial intelligence conducting therapy?
That's about as smart as the person who programmed it. And
as one of my clients would say, that's oxymoron. It's, military intelligence, artificial intelligence. Yeah, there again, if we could use some of that as a tool to help people, that's okay. But really what people are looking for is a place where they connect and can can belong, so they're looking for some kind of connection. And most people don't want when it comes to a surgeon, okay, we might cope with a surgeon with terrible bedside manners because they're a great surgeon. But when it comes to a therapist, they don't want a terrible bedside manner.
Right.
They want somebody that can hear what they're saying and
Mm-hmm.
can connect with them, and doesn't necessarily mean we fully agree.
Right.
But at least they want to know that they've got somebody who's hearing them and being able to connect with them so that they can work through some of the things. When we were going through our program, one of the big things back then was stay clear of, run for the hills, stay away from transference or counter-transference. And my primary supervisor said, that's exactly where the healing in therapy happens. That's where we therapists need to know our theories and have ourselves grounded well enough that we don't run from it, but we work with it in healing ways.
One of the most, for me, one of the most impactful transferences or countertransferences I experienced as a therapist was in my early days of internship. I'm a child of divorce. And I had been a caregiver for a long time for my mother in my parents' relationship. She today would be diagnosed with panic disorder, probably PTSD. Back then, she was diagnosed with stress-induced angina. So she went to bed for 18 months. For 18 months, I nursed her as a teenager.
Wow.
I not only nursed her, but for 9 months, I fulfilled many of her functions in the church, including doing the Women's Missionary Society meeting. Really? And at the time they decided to separate, and it was my mother's decision to separate. At the time they decided to separate, I stayed home from school one morning because I was not feeling adequately emotionally prepared to go to school. And I got up around noon and was headed out to the kitchen to fix lunch for my father and for me and for my mother. And she was barricading the door to the living room, which was the passageway to the kitchen. And she says, "You need to go where your sister is. You need to go be with your sister. She'll take care of you." My sister's 6.5 years older than I, and she had left the house the night before to stay with a friend. And I heard that as total rejection. Matter of fact, I remember my thoughts. Wait a minute, who's been taking care of whom? Perfect grammar for an English major. Before I became an English major. And I carried that with a lot of resentment and a lot of hurt. Went into a session with a young woman who, at basically the same age I was, her parents divorced. And she commented that her mother said the same thing to her. And I was all set to, "Oh, you poor thing, how rejected you must feel." And she said, "That, in and of itself, was the most loving thing my mother ever did for me." And once I scooped my chin up off the floor and could make my mouth say some words, I said, "Great therapy question. Could you help me understand how you came to that conclusion?" "Oh, my mother grew up in a very abusive home, and I am convinced that she feared she would injure me. So she sent me to the two people, my father and my sister, that she knew would protect me and would not hurt me. Wow! That allowed me to open up some memories that raised the question, did my mother grow up in an abusive home? And I started thinking about some things I had heard from family members on both sides of the family. Yeah, maybe she did. Oh, maybe that was done in love. That's one of the best countertransferences I've ever experienced in my life. And I don't regret it at all. And it was a key to healing for that client and a key to healing for me.
That sounds very, very powerful, and it's crazy how God will give revelation,
Mhm.
like that, and in a comforting way. And yeah, that's amazing. It makes me think, decisions that my parents made, even if it was out of their ignorance, God allowed it to be put in their heart for my protection, So that is very powerful, very powerful.
I was probably more open than I should have been, but anyway.
That was really great. I'm glad you shared it. Brings clarity, and it's something I'll simmer on once I leave here. Okay, so another question. Do you have a particular theory or a specific modality that you like working with the most? And if so, briefly explain that modality.
For the most part, I'm eclectic, so I'll take things. What can work with one client, I'll work with it. But as far as, there again, as far as my lens of viewing a client, I would do that typically through object relations or through life cycle theory. Just knowing that most of our interactions and relationships are so profoundly impacted by our earliest relationships in life with parents or caregivers. So out of that, realizing that people still need to be cared for, so somewhat getting a sense of their background and sort of what their underlying needs, but also putting them in, reflecting on where they are in the context of life and the cycles of life that we go through and what they're dealing with, whether they have children or whether their children are grown. So that becomes my way of sort of, for me, getting a sense of where people are coming from. Well, like I say, I will use strategies, whether it be cognitive behavioral, whether they be through some of the transactional analysis stuff, or whether it be through
You even use Gestalt.
Gestalt, or working with any of the things that will, if it seems like it will help a client, and willing to work with it, because any intervention or any kind of work I might recommend as far as an assignment for them to work on, whether it's a great so-called success or not, it still gives us information of where they're at and what they're dealing with. So even if a client comes in and says, well, I didn't do the assignment you suggested, that tells me some things about where they're at and where they're coming from, so that, but as far as seeing them from getting a sense of where they're at, I will do it through the two And probably in today's world, I would still stick primarily with object relations because of our relationships. Earliest relationships really impact us throughout life.
Even to the point, I remember Arthur, I sat in a training one day. I don't remember who the trainer was. I do remember that he was the one who first wrote the program for training safe caregivers in the Methodist Church, United Methodist Church. But he talked about working with a woman and her daughter who was nonverbal. There was no reason for her to be nonverbal. She just was nonverbal. And when asked a question, she would frequently go and cover her face, cover her mouth. At some point in the work with mom and daughter, something was said and the daughter used words for the first time. And what was said was, did your daughter ever witness physical or sexual abuse? And it came out finally that not only had the daughter witnessed and experienced in utero mom being marital rape, but raped and abused, and dad was in the home till the daughter was about 6 months old. And after the child's outburst, a physical exam was given, and it was discovered that dad had sexually abused the infant. But she kept hearing dad tell mom, don't tell anyone. And somehow or other, even prenatally, this child internalized that. That's a relationship. Not a good one, but it's a relationship. So, like Arthur, I look developmentally and probably a little less, I'm going to say, less formally object relations, but very definitely shaped by object relations. And I tend to look more at the developmental transitions and where people get stuck there. Because one of the things that has become a subspecialty for me is chronic pain and health issues. And one of the things I'm observing in myself, as well as others, some of my responses to my chronic pain, to my chronic health issues, is I can see how it's rooted in my developmental behavior, in my developmental process. And that's a weird thing to look at yourself with, but I can see that and I can own it now. I don't know if that answered your question or not, but
Yeah.
that's the answer you're getting.
Yes. So, what have been some obstacles in achieving your professional, your professional work that you have now, your actual profession and your position? What has been some obstacles in the way that kind of happened that almost, took you off the path of coming this way?
You get to start. You have the better story. How about overcoming people's perceptions?
Well, that's part of it. Because I did have a lot of people tell me that, well, you can't get into counseling, you can't see them, therefore you can't you can't counsel people if you can't see them. Fortunately, I had a few supervisors along the way that were willing to have enough belief that they would take me into the program. I suppose that would be probably one of the major ones along the way. But, as far as just an ongoing thing, once graduating and all that kind of thing, it really was then the challenge of finding employment. So primarily I have worked most of my counseling years here at the center, which is self-employment, so that yeah, we had an interview with the board and all that stuff at that time. But so I think some of the biggest challenges were just, and still at some levels, of just for people to actually think, well, okay, I can go work with that person. They've got some valuable input along the way. So it's probably been the biggest challenge along the way, just because I was always told in my years of growing up and going to a school for the blind was that you not only have to do as well as your sighted counterparts, you have to excel way above them if you're going to compete. And I would say for the most part that's extremely true. If you're not going to, so I would think that's has been the biggest challenge along the way. And like I say, even with clients today, it'll still, some get impacted by it. I had one young fellow say to me, well, you can't have eye contact, so I can't work with you. And I said, well, you've only given me 6 sessions. He said, okay. Well, I think after about 5 or 6 months, as he was ending off his work, he said, no, he was just glad. He said, I'm glad I got assigned to you. He said, I didn't think it would work. But he said, it did. So, probably the biggest obstacle most for me.
And yet, working with women who are victims of abuse, the fact that he can't see them, for them is often a bonus. Just an observation.
Well, it really depends on who you're working with. So that's true of anybody if they're going to. So, I think that would be my main one.
I think probably, okay, I think probably one of the biggest obstacles I've had to overcome was pointed out to me towards the end of my internship. I had to tag on to a different supervisor for a lot of reasons. I had my hours, but I didn't have my supervision. So I volunteered at another agency and worked with another supervisor. And in my initial supervision with him, he said to me, he said, Betty Joanne, don't know you very well, so tell me, what's the kind of client you least like to work with? Depressed, middle-aged women watching children. Guess where I was? I wasn't depressed and I didn't want to be depressed. He says, okay, so what's the next least favorite group of people to work with? Depressed anybody? He says, Betty Joanne, did you choose the wrong profession? I says, no. I went in for training as a marriage and family therapist because I wanted to help people who have good marriages have better marriages. What's that? Maybe 2%, if I'm optimistic, of the work I do. But I think overcoming some of that idealism and overcoming, I had spent a long time in training, 2 degrees worth, of trying to learn not to be bossy. And when James, my supervisor at that time, started telling me how to work with depressed clients, I looked at him and I said, James, I could have done that without going to school. I could tell people what to do and when to do it and how to do it. I spent a lot of money learning not to do that. And I think even that piece, I have to keep working on. How do I appropriately use directiveness so that I'm not re-abusing? Would you agree, Arthur? Because that's one of my biggest challenges.
Probably not.
So, what are some tips that you would give a new up and coming professional that's trying to develop and be like you two, and do a great job at it, let the Lord lead them and all of it? Like, what are some tips that you would give that person, or me specifically?
I think a couple, Rodney, would be one is I'm firmly convinced that those of us in caring professions, go into it for our own. So therapists, I think most of us go into it for our own therapy. Now, in therapy, we're there for the client. It's not for us to work on our therapy in their sessions. But a lot of times we are going to be encountering things that will hopefully cause us to do some very healthy and constructive work on some of the things in our lives, so that as long as we realize that, I think a lot of us are there because of our needs, which really does speak to Henry Nouwen's concept of the wounded healer. It's through our own woundedness that we can reach out and hopefully impact other people for their healing.
He would say that you cannot help someone heal without knowing the process of healing.
So I think not being afraid of realizing that, okay, I'm probably going into this because of my own work that I need to do, but that doesn't need to be my focus in therapy, and professionally and for my client's sake, it need not be. And I think for a lot of people, and this may sound, however it sounds, coming from a person's faith, but I think sometimes I keep telling our interns, you may want to learn to be a little more skeptical. People will come in session and they want to work on their stuff, but they're going to try and present it in the best possible light, which is understandable. All of us human beings are going to do that. That doesn't mean I have to say that they're such a terrible person, but realizing that there's probably more to the story and to what they're saying, and just realizing that they too are humans, and they're going to present it and you'll really see it in family and couple sessions, where one person is trying to present themselves as
The hero.
the healthy one of the family, and the others are needing all the help. Parents will come in and say, fix my child and life will be wonderful. More often than not, parents need the work, not the children. I think some of it is just realizing that people are people, and some days it's good to have. No, I don't verbalize that in session. I just realize that chances are what you're saying is telling me is sort of the good version of all that's happened. Okay, that's understandable. We'll work with that. I think at some point some of it is being willing to look at the emotions and the spiritual dynamics of it, so that we're not simply giving them used to do an anger management program. It had 8 sessions to it, so these people figured once they got done 8 sessions of anger management, they would never have a problem with anger again. We're always going to have problems with anger. So that just realizing that some of these things, and we do have people come back, and sometimes it's just helping them to realize that, okay, you did the work you needed to do when you were 35, and now you're 45, and some of those issues are coming at you from a different perspective because you're in a different place in life. So it's not so much that you did not do the work 10 years ago, it's more that you're just in a different place and need to revisit it and do the work in a slightly different way
to match where you are and where you're going. It's kind of that whole idea of I'm a failure there because I came, it worked, and now it doesn't work.
And that's one reason I think, Rodney, I would often say to our interns that regardless of what intervention you try, it's always going to teach you something about where the client is.
And yourself.
Well, that's true too. It'll do that. It'll teach you lots about the client, so that, and typically, we're not really going to do things that are, most people in therapy, we're not going to do things that are really going to harm the clients for the most part. Some people are terrified they're going to, well, we could, if we really go, I don't know.
Well,
But I think for the most part, as long as we're caring
and respectful.
we're not really going to be hurting people. And the potential is there. It's always there. Not to be completely ignored, but to realize that for the most part.
Yeah. One way you can harm a client. You're working with a domestic violence victim. And you tell her, just do better to be nicer and get up and fix your husband's breakfast. You have set her up to be harmed. That, I will say, you can harm people.
Yeah, we can.
If you downplay what they've told you. But you can harm them also by overplaying it. We were working with a family where another counselor was involved. And that counselor overreacted to a statement that was made. And it was devastating to the entire family. So, don't underreact and don't overreact.
If you were to hear Carl Whitaker, he would say, know your theory so well that you don't need to use it in session.
And he would also say, perfect isn't good enough. Being human is.
That's interesting.
Carl
That's-
Whitaker is a good read.
That's one of the benefits of an internship, Rodney, is that you get more time to get some of that sort of over a period of time. So, but at least I guess that's sort of the things that come to mind initially.
I guess my best advice that I give most often is if you can be real. I'm talking like the Velveteen Rabbit real. If you can be real with your clients, real with your supervisors, real with yourself and real before God. Whatever you do that seems to be ineffective, you don't know what the end of the story is.
Mhm.
I've had clients come back after 10 years and say some things that I didn't remember saying, but that's what they heard. And it's amazing what a change it's made. Yeah, they came back for more work because they were in a different place. So don't feel like you have to fix everything. You just have to be. Trying to think of the reference for that one, but I can't. I know it's out of some literature. You just have to be. It's partly out. It really is partly out of the whole attitude and story of the Velveteen Rabbit. If you migrate very much into addictions treatment, you will see 2 or 3 different addictions version of the Velveteen Rabbit. And I will be very honest, most of our training programs don't do enough with addictions. And I always encourage counselors, just for kicks and giggles. You don't have to go for licensure in addictions. Go get a certificate in addictions. That's where you learn some of the healthy skepticism. We both had to learn to do ASI's, addiction severity indexes, because we were working in a different program. And the trainer said, if they tell you they drink 3 drinks a night, at least double it, maybe triple it.
Wow.
The same is true, I think, in almost every aspect of counseling. If they're painting a really rosy picture, there's some really deep hurt that they can't talk about yet. That pretty much summarizes what I say, isn't it? Doesn't it?
Yeah.
So I have 2 more questions, short questions. What population have you supported most? Christians, addictions, marriage, different mental health? issues. So, what has been the population that you have supported mostly in your career so far?
Trauma.
Trauma.
Across the spectrum.
Has it been difficult to work with the different traumas, or was it something that you kind of, I guess, had in mind that that's what you
No, it was the
expected?
last thing in the world I wanted to do. I told you, I wanted to help make good marriages better.
So that was a bit of a shell shock then.
I think we both said we didn't want to work with crisis and we didn't want to work with trauma. So what was my first job? Trauma specialist.
Wow.
Well, domestic violence therapist. Was a domestic violence / sexual assault therapist was my first job.
Wow.
I didn't want to work with either one. Ever. It has truly informed the work I do.
Mhm.
And it gives me a framework in working with chronic pain, because trauma is chronic pain.
Mhm.
Majority of people, I guess, work with individuals, but as far as any particular group, I probably have done more couple counseling than anything else,
True.
along with families. But, and I find that to be a very challenging thing.
Arthur is one of the people that is amazing. His boundaries are so good that he can work with the whole family, with parts and pieces of the family. And what he gets in the individual type work doesn't ever come out except as those people bring it out. And he can hold all of that. I think one of the terms our supervisor used a lot was, our job is to be the container. Well, Arthur's a huge container. He can contain all those big bunches of pieces. Like very few therapists I've ever seen, and I've worked with some good ones. I'm good, but unless there are only a very few couples or families that I will work with as the only therapist. That's the other piece. It is not necessarily cost effective, but some of the best work you can do with couples and families is co-therapy. We have at times had 5 therapists working with a family of 5. And done group sessions with all of us and individual sessions with each of them. And there's a magic and a dynamic to that because we are self-employed, we can do that. Most centers would not at all allow that because it's not cost effective. But it is relationally effective because multiple therapists can model the changes they want to see happen. And little by little, you see it happening. You see them doing what you've been demonstrating. Arthur's gifted at somehow or other making that work even if it's only him. But most of us need a little more help than that.
lots of work to be done, Rodney. So.
And
Yes.
Rodney, some of the things that Arthur and I have just been doing is summed up in one word. Best advice I can give: edify. Edify your coworkers, edify your clients. We're here to build them up, not to tear them down.
I don't know if I answered both of those questions at the same time. I thought got lost in the
Yeah, that was definitely along the lines of what I definitely needed to hear, especially edify, because I mean a lot of people don't understand the importance of edifying other people and what that edification does to that person, as you know, a Christian or a non-Christian, as a married couple, as a person that's been through traumatic events or whatever the case may be, or if he's a co-worker, you know, that edification does a lot to the spirit.
You want to have a fun time learning about edification? Go to YouTube. Look up Florence Littauer, Littauer. There's a 52-minute video called Silver Boxes. 49 or 52, something like that. You want to watch it. We heard it live one time, and as we walked to our hotel rooms, I looked at Arthur and I said, honey, I have just been sucker punched, slapped upside the head, and made to laugh at myself all at the same time.
That's cool.
Anything of hers is good. It might not match up to the theory you're learning, but it's good. And it's well-grounded.
Okay, well, I guess that concludes